Joining me now to discuss all of this is Richard Benedetto. He's a former White House correspondent and columnist for USA Today. Joining me from Paris is Frank Romano. He is a professor of law, literature and history at the University of Paris, and also with us here in the studio is Marc Hujer. He is the Washington bureau chief for the German publication Der Spiegel. He has covered Hillary Clinton and the Bush family. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you to the show. Richard, let me start with you, and I'll start with a quote from Professor Larry Sabato, who is writing in Politico magazine, which is a well-known political magazine here in the United States. He wrote, "The very idea that two alternating families would occupy the White House for 28 of the 36 years between 1989 and 2025 would have been abhorrent to America's founding fathers. The presidency was never supposed to be a household inheritance. Yet that is what we have."
Yeah, I think it's kind of a coincidence, though. We just happen to have an interesting confluence of two families coming at this particular time. I'm not sure that that's a trend as much as it is a product of these particular two families, Bush and Clinton. It's not that they've inherited their offices by divine right. They've had to go out and compete for them and prove that they've been successful politicians in their own right. So that I don't think that anybody really, Americans don't think of it in terms of, well, let's just turn it over to the family we like.
Right, Frank, do you agree? Is there no sense of entitlement here on the part of the Bushes and the Clintons? Did they really have to go hard and work for this office?
Well, I think it's more than that. I kind of disagree. I think it was Mr. Benedetto that said there was a coincidence. That is the more of the theory of some of my academics, looking at the objective, as in your introduction, Americans, the founding fathers would be appalled at the possible dynasty of two families. Entitlement, it's not a coincidence, because then there's the second theory, and we're talking about the foreign theory, in particular in Europe and in France, that more of the skeptical theory, more of the realistic theory that American politicians are no different than most politicians of the world, not to mention European politicians, where I'm coming from Paris, is there are many interests that tend to be guiding, perhaps even leading the leaders by the nose, and Hillary, Bill Clinton, and H.W. Bush, W. Bush are no exception. And if we just make a quick list, we have the banks, and of course, we have Hollywood behind the typical Democratic candidate who will be in support of Hillary Clinton. And we have banks and oil and big business behind the Bush contingency.
Right, that is an issue which we will talk about, and that is the money behind all these candidates. Marc, there is the idea of equality. You know, we often hear in the United States that anyone can become president here in the United States. You have that opportunity. But is that just a smokescreen?
Well, I think it is not, because if I compare it with European politics, particularly politics in my country, their candidates are selected by the party. So basically, we have two major parties. We can select between two candidates. Whereas in the United States, you have a much more open system with the primary system, and you have candidates who can run for office. And we've just seen it in last election. I mean, the primaries, you have Tea Party members who can come out of nothing and get voted in office. So I think in general, U.S. politics is, compared to European politics, much more open to candidates who come from nothing. And I think it doesn't contradict the fact that you have those dynasties who are important for American politics and who are important because there is this very interesting mix of policy, a serious policy discussion, and on the other hand, this desire for a royal family in a way. And this kind of mix is very, very important for American politics. It draws in people because you can have somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger running, and you don't have a discussion on policy in that matter, but you, in this very competitive political system, you can bring in people who are all of a sudden interested into politics because you have an interesting candidate running.
Right.
Well, you know, Bill Clinton is, Bill Clinton didn't inherit anything. He was a guy who comes from the notion that anybody could become president. Bill Clinton grew up in humble circumstances. He was not part of any spoon-fed royal family. He was worked his way up, and that was his story. His story was that the man from Hope, he came from a small town in Hope, Arkansas, and made himself so that now he's the dynasty. He created the dynasty. It's just it's him and his wife. But it's not that there's been this long line, and then the notion that the Bushes have access to oil money and banking money, while the Clintons have access to Hollywood. Well, that's party more than it is people. It's the Republicans will have bank backing and oil backing, and the Democrats will have some of this Hollywood backing. That doesn't make any difference whether it's Clinton or Bush.
Okay, Frank, we have something like 152 million Americans who are over the age of 35 who are eligible to run for the presidency, but Americans keep flocking back to the same old names. Is it because of the fact that they like the familiar names? You know, better the devil we know.
Yes, that's what we call name recognition. And I would like to commend the fellow commentators about their rendition of the history of the tendencies in the U.S. that have high mobility. And even using Bill Clinton as an example and other presidential candidates. Well, this is part of the theory of the academics I work with that look in the history and see, well, if you look past the past 100 years, there are maybe 4 families, strong families that have been engaged in a dynasty, and the Bush family is one of them. But that's history, and what happens is when power is gained, in particular the Clinton family, and what we're talking about now is a very different phenomenon. It's very rare, if not ever, in American politics. And you can take any Western democratic country as an example to see that there'd be 28 years of dominance by 2 families is a rare phenomenon. This is a rare phenomenon that needs to be analyze. This new dynasty is a real thing. And another thing I'm opposed to is we're linking banks and oil to Bush as well as banks and Hollywood to Hillary. And I think it was Richard who stated that it's something to do with the party. But the party is in control of the candidate. And even though, yes, and so our interests, we cannot ignore these interests behind the candidates, pretty well calling the shots. This is something it needs to be discussed in the U.S., flies in the face of a rugged individual being able to have mobility, even becoming president, has perhaps changed, and things have evolved in the U.S. where it's been said that the top 2/3, and talking about economically, will die in the top 2/3, and the bottom 2/3 will die in the bottom 2/3. There are changes here that need to be analyzed. This American spirit might be now rendering into a dynasty that is that will perhaps make our founding fathers roll over in their grave.
Right, Richard, isn't there another problem with these kind of dynastic presidencies here? Is that where you have people who work for a certain president. I mean, you think of the older George Bush, George H.W. Bush. He had people like Dick Cheney working for him. He had Colin Powell working for him. They ended up in the George W. Bush presidency as well. So we don't have any kind of diversity as far as that is concerned. There's no creativity. There's no new blood being brought in. It's the same old people going round and round.
Well, that's partially true. The fact that George W. Bush brought in people from his father's administration who had experience is true. The fact that Bill Clinton reached back to the last Democratic presidential administration as well. He brought some people in who had worked in the Kennedy administration. He brought some people in who had worked in the Carter administration. It's true that there were more personal relationships between the Bushes and their people, and I think that's a function of the Bushes. The Bushes were very personal in their politics, in their gaining, bringing people in to their inner circle. They were people that they were not only competent in their eyes in the issues they were dealing with, but also friends. They saw them as friends. And that's a family kind of thing, so that right. It is a kind of a dynastic question. But the thing is that, and I would guess that Hillary would probably bring in people from Bill's administration if she were to win the presidency as well. But I think we should talk about the media in this too. Mm-hmm. What is the role of the media in these dynasties? Because of the fact that the media, which once loved the Mavericks, seem to now gravitate toward the people they know. and the people they are more familiar with, and kind of dismiss the mavericks or that are trying to be seen as insurgents. For example, a Ted Cruz in the Republican Party, maybe now Elizabeth Warren in the Democratic Party. It's up to the media to give everybody a fair shake here.
Okay, let me get Frank's take on this. Frank, what about the fact that, this is, these dynastic presidencies depend on friends, they depend on people who they regard as being competent, being brought into new administrations?
It's very disturbing, because bringing in familiar faces, of course, this also is part of name recognition. People are familiar with these people. They feel there's consistency between administrations, even though the father Bush's administration was not just opposed to George W. Bush's administration. It's very disturbing, because what does this indicate also to the world? And again, I'm trying to keep a world perspective here, being that I've lived in Europe many years, is inflexibility in foreign policy. Bringing in the same people can also mean that we're continuing the same foreign policy that have not been very successful. Now, when we talk about Father Bush's policies, now, he was pretty wise when it came to the fall of the Iron Curtain and how he juggled his relationship between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. But he was still very interventionalist, and it gave rise, and transferring, of course, Colin Powell and, of course, Cheney transferred to a younger Bush's administration. They were able to carry out the interventionist policy to the hilt, and we saw how that happened in the the Iraqi and the Afghan situation. So this is part of the familiarity transferring around, but that from one person to the other, from one administration to another. But again, getting back to the dynasty, or is this just passing the baton of power like in a relay race, and it's the same racers?
Mm-hmm. Marc, Frank raises a great point there, and that is when you have people from the old administration coming into the new administration, they bring those policies with them. Hypothetically, if we have a Jeb Bush presidency, I mean, are we likely to see a Cheney, a Rumsfeld, a Condoleezza Rice, a Colin Powell?
Well, first of all, we know we had already 2 Bushes in the White House, and definitely they pursued a different kind of policy. And it didn't mean the George W. Bush presidency is not in total a continuation of the George Bush one's presidency. So that doesn't mean that you have necessarily a continuation. On the other hand, you also have experience who comes in with the old people who have served already. And as when Bill Clinton came in the office, everybody was complaining about the chaotic situation that you had there, and you've seen one of the criticisms about Barack Obama is how difficult it is to navigate in the political system in Washington, and loses a lot of steam by not being able to push through his policies. So I think it has both sides to it, and I don't see it as necessarily as bad. You have to keep the balance. There are both sides on it, but I'm not. It's not a major concern, I think.
Okay. We will continue our discussion more on U.S. presidential politics when we come back.